On a frozen Christmas morning in 2024, Jennifer was found dead in her house by her own daughter. Detective Marcus Rivera received a call that would haunt him for the rest of his career. A 17-year-old girl named Sarah Mitchell had walked into the Portland, Maine police station at 2:47 a.m., her clothes splattered with blood, and calmly announced that she had just murdered her mother. The small coastal city of Portland, known for its picturesque harbor and thriving arts scene rather than violent crime, was about to be thrust into the national spotlight by a case that would challenge everything investigators thought they understood about teenage psychology, family dynamics, and the capacity for calculated violence. Before we continue, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your support helps us continue bringing you these in-depth stories. Now let's get back to the story. Detective Rivera, a 22-year veteran of the Portland Police Department, initially assumed the teenager standing before him was herself a victim. Perhaps having witnessed her mother's murder or escape from an attacker, Sarah Mitchell stood in the fluorescent-lit lobby of the station, her long dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt that bore dark stains later confirmed to be her mother's blood. Her brown eyes were dry, her voice steady, and her demeanor unnervingly calm as she repeated her statement to the duty officer. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I live at 342 Ocean View Drive. I stabbed my mother, Jennifer Mitchell, approximately 45 minutes ago. She's dead. You'll find her body in the kitchen." The clinical precision of her statement, delivered without tears or visible emotion, immediately triggered alarm bells for Rivera, who had interviewed hundreds of suspects and witnesses over his career, and recognized that genuine trauma rarely presented with such eerie composure. The Mitchell home, a beautifully restored Victorian in Portland's historic West End neighborhood, sat just 3 blocks from the police station, its gabled roof and wraparound porch representing the architectural charm that made the area one of Maine's most desirable addresses. Officers arriving at the scene within minutes of Sarah's confession found the front door unlocked, just as she had indicated, and discovered Jennifer Mitchell's body exactly where her daughter had described. The 43-year-old real estate agent lay on the Italian tile floor of her renovated kitchen, surrounded by a pool of blood that had spread across the light-colored surface in a grotesque pattern. The medical examiner would later count 27 stab wounds across Jennifer's chest, abdomen, and defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating a frenzied, sustained attack that had likely lasted several minutes before the victim succumbed to massive blood loss and trauma. The murder weapon, a 10-inch chef's knife from the kitchen's expensive knife block, lay in the sink, partially rinsed but still bearing traces of blood and tissue. Forensic analysis would later reveal that Sarah had attempted to clean the knife after the murder, running it underwater for approximately 90 seconds based on water flow calculations and drainage patterns, before apparently abandoning this effort and deciding instead to turn herself in to police. This detail would become significant as prosecutors built their case, arguing that the attempt to clean the weapon demonstrated consciousness of guilt and a brief period of rational decision-making immediately following the crime, contradicting later defense claims of diminished capacity due to emotional distress. Jennifer Mitchell had been a prominent figure in Portland's tight-knit community, serving on the school board, volunteering with the local food bank, and running one of the city's most successful real estate agencies. Colleagues described her as driven, charismatic, and demanding, with high expectations for both her employees and her only daughter. The walls of her home office, which investigators processed as part of the crime scene, were covered with professional accolades, sales awards, and photographs of Jennifer with local politicians and business leaders. Notably absent from these displays were pictures of Sarah, whose bedroom upstairs revealed a stark contrast to her mother's professional shrine. The teenager's space, decorated with art prints, stacks of books, and a desk covered with acceptance letters from prestigious universities where Sarah had been admitted for the fall 2023 semester. Sarah Mitchell had been, by all external measures, the perfect daughter, a straight A student at Portland High School, captain of the debate team, volunteer at the local animal shelter, and recipient of multiple academic scholarships. Teachers described her as exceptionally bright, articulate, and mature for her age, though several noted that she seemed to carry an unusual level of stress and anxiety, particularly regarding her mother's expectations. Sarah's guidance counselor, Martha Chen, would later provide crucial testimony about conversations in which Sarah had expressed feeling suffocated by her mother's control over every aspect of her life. From her course selections to her college applications, to her friendships and after-school activities. Sarah told me in December that she sometimes felt like she wasn't a person, just a project her mother was perfecting, Jen recalled. She said she couldn't remember the last time she'd made a decision about her own life without her mother's approval. The relationship between Jennifer and Sarah Mitchell had been complicated by the absence of Sarah's father, who had died in a car accident when Sarah was just 3 years old. Jennifer had raised Sarah alone, pouring all her considerable energy and ambition into ensuring her daughter would have every advantage, every opportunity, every tool for success. What might have appeared from the outside as devoted single parenting had, according to Sarah's later statements and corroborating evidence from friends and extended family, evolved into something far more controlling and psychologically damaging. Jennifer had installed monitoring software on Sarah's phone and laptop, tracked her daughter's location through multiple apps, and required detailed accounts of how Sarah spent every minute of her day. The teenager's schedule was planned down to 15-minute increments, leaving no time for spontaneous activities or unstructured relaxation that Jennifer considered wasteful. The night of the murder had begun with what Sarah described as a typical argument about her future, specifically about which college she would attend in the fall. Sarah had been accepted to Brown University, her first choice, where she hoped to study creative writing and literature. Jennifer, however, had decided that Sarah would attend the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania to pursue business, following in her mother's entrepreneurial footsteps. She wouldn't even discuss it, Sarah told Detective Rivera during her initial interview at the station. She said she'd already paid the deposit to Wharton, already declined Brown on my behalf, already planned out my entire college career, and the internships I would do, and the MBA I would get afterward. She said I was being selfish and ungrateful for even wanting to study creative writing, that it was a waste of my potential. According to Sarah's detailed account, the argument had escalated throughout the evening of February 10th, beginning at dinner and continuing for nearly 4 hours. Jennifer had presented Sarah with a detailed 5-year plan, a literal document with timelines and milestones that mapped out Sarah's life from college graduation through her mid-20s, including the type of job she would pursue, the salary expectations, even the appropriate age for marriage and children. When Sarah expressed that she wanted to make her own choices about her future, Jennifer had responded, according to Sarah, by threatening to withdraw all financial support, refuse to complete any financial aid forms, and ensure Sarah couldn't attend any college that fall. She told me that if I wouldn't follow her plan, I could figure out my life on my own, starting with finding somewhere else to live since I clearly didn't appreciate everything she'd sacrificed for me. Sarah recounted, her voice still disturbingly flat even as she described what should have been an emotionally charged confrontation. The actual murder had occurred around 1:30 a.m., several hours after the argument had seemingly concluded with Sarah retreating to her bedroom. Sarah described lying in bed, unable to sleep, thinking about the future that had been planned for her without her consent. The Brown acceptance she hadn't known had been declined, the life she wanted slipping away because of her mother's unilateral decisions. I went downstairs to try one more time to talk to her, to make her understand, Sarah explained. She was in the kitchen, entering something into her laptop, probably working even at that hour like she always did. When I tried to bring it up again, she didn't even look up from her screen. She just said, "This discussion is over, Sarah. You'll thank me in 10 years when you're successful." And something inside me just broke. What happened next, according to Sarah's confession and physical evidence from the scene, was a sustained, violent attack that bore little resemblance to a moment of sudden rage or temporary loss of control. Sarah described retrieving the knife from the block on the counter, approaching her mother from behind, and stabbing her in the shoulder. Jennifer had spun around, shock and pain evident on her face, and tried to defend herself, grabbing at Sarah's arms and the knife. The struggle had moved from the counter area to the center of the kitchen, with Jennifer first fighting back, then trying to escape, then finally pleading for her life as the blood loss weakened her. She kept asking why, telling me she loved me, that we could work this out, Sarah recalled, but I couldn't stop. Every time I thought about stopping, I thought about Brown, about creative writing, about every choice she'd taken from me, and I just kept stabbing. The forensic evidence supported Sarah's account of a prolonged attack. Blood spatter patterns indicated movement throughout the kitchen, with arterial spray on 3 different walls, suggesting Jennifer had been in various positions as she tried to defend herself and escape. Defensive wounds on Jennifer's hands and forearms showed she had attempted to grab the knife or block the strikes, fighting for her life even as the wounds accumulated. The medical examiner determined that while several of the early stab wounds would have been eventually fatal without medical intervention, Jennifer had remained conscious and aware for most of the attack, likely understanding in her final moments that her own daughter was killing her. This detail, perhaps more than any other, would haunt those who worked the case, and would later be emphasized by prosecutors as evidence of the particularly cruel nature of Sarah's crime. After Jennifer had finally stopped moving, Sarah reported standing in the kitchen for approximately 10 minutes, the bloody knife still in her hand, looking at what she had done. I remember thinking very clearly that I needed to clean up, that I needed to make it look like a break-in or something, she told Rivera. I turned on the water and started washing the knife, but then I realized it didn't matter. There was too much blood, too much evidence. And besides, I didn't want to lie about it. I'd spent my whole life lying, pretending to be the daughter she wanted instead of who I really was. So I decided to just tell the truth. This decision to confess immediately, walking to the police station, in the early morning hours rather than attempting to construct an alibi or stage the scene, would become a central point of debate during Sarah's trial. With prosecutors arguing it demonstrated rational thought and consciousness of guilt, while the defense contended it showed Sarah's complete psychological collapse in the aftermath of the crime. The initial processing of Sarah Mitchell at the police station followed standard protocols for homicide suspects, though the unusual circumstance of her voluntary surrender and immediate confession created some procedural complications. Detective Rivera read Sarah her Miranda rights in the presence of a juvenile officer, as required by Maine law for suspects under 18, carefully explaining each right and ensuring she understood the implications of speaking without an attorney present. Sarah waived her right to counsel, stating calmly, "I don't need a lawyer. I'm guilty. I'm just telling you what happened." This waiver would later be challenged by her defense team as invalid given Sarah's emotional state, but Judge Patricia Thornton ultimately ruled that the video footage of the rights advisement showed Sarah as alert, responsive, and clearly understanding the choice she was making. Sarah's formal interview, conducted in a room with both video and audio recording, lasted nearly 3 hours and provided a chillingly detailed account of not just the murder itself, but the years of psychological control and emotional manipulation that Sarah identified as the context for her violent response. She described a childhood where love was conditional on achievement, where mistakes were met with cold silence that could last for days, where her mother's approval was the currency that determined her worth. "I got straight A's because anything less meant I was lazy and ungrateful," Sarah explained. "I did debate because Mom said it would look good on college applications. I volunteered at the shelter because Mom scheduled it into my calendar. I don't think I've made a real choice about my own life since I was in elementary school." Dr. Patricia Wong, a forensic psychologist who observed the interview at Detective Rivera's request, noted that Sarah displayed what she later described in her report as paradoxical affect, demonstrating emotional flatness when discussing the murder itself, but showing more animation and distress when describing her mother's control over her life. This pattern suggested to me that Sarah had not yet fully processed the reality of her mother's death and her own role in causing it. Dr. Wong wrote, "Her emotional energy remained focused on the circumstances that led to the crime rather than the crime itself, indicating possible dissociation or psychological compartmentalization." This observation would become crucial in the defense's later argument that Sarah had been experiencing a dissociative state during and immediately after the murder, rendering her incapable of the kind of deliberate premeditation required for first-degree murder. The investigation of Sarah Mitchell quickly expanded beyond her confession to include a thorough examination of the mother-daughter relationship and the digital trail that documented years of controlling behavior. Forensic technicians seized both Jennifer's and Sarah's electronic devices, recovering thousands of text messages, emails, and documents that painted a disturbing picture of parental control that extended far beyond normal boundaries. Jennifer's laptop contained detailed spreadsheets tracking Sarah's grades, extracurricular activities, and even social interactions, with color-coded ratings indicating whether each element contributed to or detracted from Sarah's college applications. More disturbing were the monitoring logs, showing that Jennifer had been tracking Sarah's location through multiple apps, reading her text messages in real time through spyware installed on Sarah's phone, and even accessing Sarah's email accounts to read and sometimes respond to messages as if she were Sarah. Particularly significant were emails Jennifer had sent to Brown University and the University of Pennsylvania in mid-January, just 3 weeks before the murder. Without Sarah's knowledge or permission, Jennifer had declined Brown's acceptance offer on her daughter's behalf, writing an email that purported to be from Sarah expressing gratitude for the opportunity, but explaining that after careful consideration, Sarah had decided to pursue other options. In the same week, Jennifer had accepted Wharton's offer, again writing as Sarah, and had even begun corresponding with the business school about course selections and housing preferences. These emails, recovered during the digital forensics investigation, provided concrete evidence of the extent to which Jennifer had taken control of Sarah's future, making irreversible decisions about her daughter's life without any input from Sarah herself. Friends and extended family members, interviewed as part of the investigation, corroborated Sarah's description of an increasingly controlling and psychologically damaging relationship. Sarah's maternal aunt, Patricia Greenwood, told investigators that she had confronted her sister multiple times about her parenting approach, expressing concern that Jennifer was treating Sarah more like an employee than a daughter. "I told Jenny that Sarah needed room to breathe, to make her own mistakes, to figure out who she was," Patricia recalled. Jenny's response was always the same. "Sarah will thank me when she's successful. I know what's best for her future." She genuinely couldn't see that she was suffocating Sarah, or maybe she saw it and didn't care because the outcome, a successful daughter, was more important to her than Sarah's happiness or autonomy. Sarah's best friend, Maya Patel, provided testimony that would prove crucial in establishing the timeline of Sarah's deteriorating mental state in the months before the murder. Maya described increasing isolation as Jennifer restricted Sarah's social activities, requiring her to account for every minute spent with friends and eventually forbidding certain friendships that Jennifer deemed distracting or not goal-oriented enough. Sarah stopped coming to things, Maya told police. Her mom would call her in the middle of hanging out and demand she come home, or she'd say she couldn't go somewhere because her mom had already scheduled something else. By senior year, Sarah basically only saw people at school. Her mom controlled everything. Most significantly, Maya recalled a conversation in late January where Sarah had said, "Sometimes I think The only way I'll ever be free is if something happens to my mom. I know that's terrible, but I can't live like this anymore." This statement, made just 2 weeks before the murder, would become central to the prosecution's case. Evidence that Sarah had been contemplating her mother's death in the period leading up to the crime. When Maya expressed shock during her police interview that Sarah might have actually acted on such thoughts, Detective Rivera gently explained that many people express momentary frustration with family members without acting violently, but that, in Sarah's case, the statement took on additional significance given subsequent events. Maya broke down crying at this point in her interview, expressing guilt that she hadn't taken Sarah's comment more seriously, or reported it to a counselor or authority figure who might have intervened. The Portland community reacted to Jennifer Mitchell's murder with shock and confusion, struggling to reconcile the accomplished, civic-minded businesswoman they had known with the controlling, manipulative mother described in the investigation. The Portland Press Herald ran a front-page story titled "Behind Closed Doors: The Double Life of Jennifer Mitchell," exploring the disconnect between Jennifer's public persona and her private behavior with her daughter. The article sparked intense debate in the community, with some defending Jennifer's memory as a devoted mother whose only crime was wanting the best for her daughter, while others expressed sympathy for Sarah, viewing her as a victim who had finally broken under years of psychological abuse. The Cumberland County District Attorney, Michael Patterson, faced a difficult decision about how to charge Sarah Mitchell. Maine law permitted juveniles as young as 15 to be tried as adults for murder, and the case's high profile combined with the brutal nature of the crime created significant public pressure for the harshest possible prosecution. However, Patterson recognized that the circumstances surrounding the murder, particularly the extensive evidence of psychological abuse and control, complicated the straightforward narrative of a daughter killing her mother. After consulting with his senior prosecutors and reviewing the evidence, Patterson announced that Sarah would be charged as an adult with intentional or knowing murder, Maine's equivalent to first-degree murder, but that his office would be open to considering a plea agreement that acknowledged the mitigating circumstances of the case. Sarah's appointed attorney, Robert Callahan, a public defender with 18 years of experience in juvenile and criminal defense, immediately began building a defense strategy centered on what he termed cumulative provocation, arguing that years of psychological abuse had created a mental state in which Sarah's capacity for rational decision-making was severely impaired. Callahan retained Dr. Amanda Foster, a clinical psychologist specializing in family trauma and coercive control, to evaluate Sarah and provide expert testimony on and about the psychological impact of Jennifer's parenting style. Dr. Foster spent over 20 hours interviewing Sarah, reviewing the documentary evidence of Jennifer's control, and administering various psychological assessments designed to evaluate Sarah's mental state, both at the time of the crime and during the evaluation period. Dr. Foster's report, filed with the court as part of the defense's motion to suppress Sarah's confession and reduce charges, described Sarah as suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from years of emotional abuse, psychological control, and the systematic erasure of her autonomy and identity. Sarah Mitchell was not raised by a mother. She was managed by a controller, Dr. Foster wrote. Every aspect of her life, from major decisions about her education to minor choices about her daily schedule, was determined by Jennifer Mitchell without regard for Sarah's own preferences, needs, or developing sense of self. The psychological literature is clear that this type of coercive control, particularly when exercised by a parental figure during the critical years of identity formation, can result in severe psychological damage, including dissociative responses, impaired decision-making capacity, and in extreme cases, violent reactions when the victim perceives no other escape from the controlling relationship. The prosecution retained its own expert, Dr. Leonard Ross, a forensic psychiatrist who had testified in numerous high-profile cases throughout New England. Dr. Ross evaluated Sarah approximately 6 weeks after her arrest and reached markedly different conclusions about her mental state and culpability. While acknowledging that Jennifer's parenting style had been controlling and that Sarah had experienced significant stress, Dr. Ross concluded that Sarah did not meet the criteria for any mental disorder that would have impaired her ability to appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions or to conform her conduct to the requirements of law. Ms. Mitchell knew exactly what she was doing when she stabbed her mother 27 times, Dr. Ross wrote in his report. Her detailed account of the crime, her attempt to clean the murder weapon, and her decision to turn herself into police all demonstrate rational thought processes and understanding of the legal and moral implications of her actions. While she may have felt trapped by her mother's expectations, feeling trapped is not the same as being legally insane or incapable of choosing a non-violent response to her situation. As Sarah's case moved through the pre-trial phase, a significant dispute emerged over the admissibility of her immediate post-arrest confession. Defense attorney Callahan filed a motion to suppress the entire 3-hour interview, arguing that Sarah had not been in a mental state capable of knowingly and voluntarily waiving her Miranda rights or providing a reliable statement to police. My client had just killed her mother, walked 3 blocks through a Maine winter night in the early morning hours, and presented herself to police in a dissociative state, Callahan argued during the suppression hearing. The video shows a young woman who speaks in a monotone, displays no appropriate emotional response to the situation, and exhibits classic signs of psychological shock and trauma. Any waiver of rights obtained under these circumstances cannot be considered knowing and voluntary as required by law. The prosecution's response emphasized Sarah's coherence during the interview, her ability to provide detailed and accurate information about the crime, and her explicit statements that she understood she was confessing to murder and could have an attorney if she chose. The defendant's emotional presentation does not negate her cognitive understanding of the situation, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Park argued. She correctly answered every question about her understanding of her rights. She explained in detail what had happened and why. She acknowledged multiple times that she knew what she had done was wrong. The law does not require a suspect to be emotionally demonstrative to validly waive their rights. It requires that they understand those rights and choose to waive them. The evidence clearly shows Ms. Mitchell understood and chose. Judge Patricia Thornton, after viewing the video of Sarah's interview and reviewing the psychological expert reports from both sides, ruled that the confession would be admissible at trial. While the court recognizes that the defendant had recently experienced a traumatic event, namely killing her own mother, the video evidence demonstrates that she was alert, oriented, and able to understand and respond to questions about her rights, Judge Thornton ruled. Her emotional flatness, while unusual, does not establish that she lacked the cognitive capacity to waive her rights. The motion to suppress is denied. This ruling was a significant blow to the defense, as Sarah's detailed confession would provide the prosecution with powerful evidence of her knowledge, intent, and understanding of her actions. The case of State of Maine versus Sarah Mitchell went to trial in September 2023, 7 months after the February murder, in a Cumberland County courthouse packed with spectators, media representatives, and legal observers interested in the intersection of juvenile justice, domestic abuse, and criminal responsibility. Judge Thornton, known for her careful management of high-profile cases, had granted a defense motion for a change of venue within Cumberland County to ensure a jury could be seated from a pool less saturated with pretrial publicity. Though the case remained well known throughout Maine and had attracted national attention from media outlets covering juvenile justice issues. The jury selection process took 5 days, with both sides carefully questioning potential jurors about their views on juvenile offenders, domestic violence, parental authority, and whether they could fairly consider evidence of psychological abuse as a mitigating factor in a murder case. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from mid-20s to late 60s, including 3 parents of teenagers who had survived the voir dire process, despite defense concerns that parents might be less sympathetic to a daughter who killed her mother. Prosecutor Michael Patterson's opening statement portrayed Sarah Mitchell as a privileged teenager who responded to normal parental expectations with extreme violence rather than patience or compromise. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about choices," Patterson began, standing directly before the jury box. Sarah Mitchell had many choices available to her on the night of February 10th. She could have waited until she turned 18 and moved out. She could have confided in her aunt, who would later testify that she had offered Sarah a place to live if things got too difficult at home. She could have spoken with school counselors, who were available and receptive. She could have applied to colleges on her own, obtained her own financial aid, charted her own course. But instead, Sarah Mitchell chose murder. She chose to take a 10-inch knife from her kitchen, approach her mother from behind, and stab her 27 times while her mother begged for her life. Patterson methodically outlined the evidence the prosecution would present: the confession, the forensic evidence from the crime scene, the medical examiner's testimony about Jennifer's suffering during the prolonged attack, and most importantly, evidence that Sarah had been functioning rationally in the days and hours before the murder, participating normally in school activities and social media, showing no signs of the kind of psychological break that might support a claim of diminished capacity. You will hear the defense argue that Sarah was driven to this crime by years of psychological abuse, that she snapped under unbearable pressure, Patterson told the jury. But the evidence will show that this was not a snap decision. This was a deliberate choice to eliminate the source of Sarah's frustration rather than finding one of many nonviolent solutions available to her. Defense attorney Robert Callahan's opening statement painted an entirely different picture, framing Sarah as the victim of years of psychological torture who had finally broken under conditions that no human being could reasonably be expected to endure. "What you're going to see in this trial is not a case of a spoiled teenager angry about parental rules," Callahan began. "What you're going to see is the systematic psychological destruction of a young girl by a parent who treated her daughter as an extension of herself, a project to be perfected, a resume to be polished, rather than a human being with her own thoughts, feelings, and rights to self-determination." Callahan described the evidence the defense would present: the monitoring software Jennifer had installed on Sarah's devices, the spreadsheets tracking every aspect of Sarah's life, the emails Jennifer had sent impersonating Sarah to make irreversible decisions about her future, and most importantly, expert testimony about the psychological impact of this level of control on a developing adolescent mind. Dr. Amanda Foster will explain to you that what Jennifer Mitchell was doing to her daughter has a name in the psychological literature: coercive control. It's a pattern of behavior that strips away a person's autonomy, their sense of self, their ability to make choices about their own life, and you will learn that people subjected to this kind of sustained psychological abuse can reach a breaking point where their capacity for rational thought is overwhelmed by a desperate need to escape what feels like an intolerable situation. The prosecution's case began with Detective Marcus Rivera's testimony, establishing the basic facts of Sarah's confession and the discovery of Jennifer's body. Rivera described Sarah's demeanor at the police station as unusually calm but coherent, explaining that she had provided specific details about the crime that were later verified by physical evidence. The video of Sarah's confession was played for the jury in its entirety. A 3-hour recording that showed Sarah sitting in the interview room, occasionally accepting offers of water or using the restroom, speaking in measured tones about the argument with her mother and the subsequent attack. The jury watched with visible discomfort as Sarah described the actual stabbing, her voice remaining flat and unemotional even as she recounted her mother's pleas for mercy. She asked me why I was doing this, told me she loved me, said we could fix whatever was wrong, Sarah said on the video. But I knew we couldn't fix it. She would never let me live my own life. She would control me forever unless I stopped her. This statement, delivered without tears or apparent emotion, seemed to disturb several jurors who shifted uncomfortably in their seats or exchanged glances with one another. Dr. Robert Chen, the medical examiner who had performed Jennifer Mitchell's autopsy, provided testimony that was graphic and difficult for spectators to hear, describing each of the 27 stab wounds and explaining which injuries would have been immediately life-threatening versus those that contributed to the cumulative trauma that ultimately killed Jennifer. Using anatomical diagrams rather than actual autopsy photographs to spare the jury the most disturbing images, Dr. Chen explained that Jennifer had suffered wounds to both lungs, her liver, and her heart, with a heart wound likely being the final fatal injury. Based on the pattern and location of the wounds, the victim was initially standing and attempting to defend herself, using her hands and arms to block or deflect the blade, Dr. Chen testified. As she weakened from blood loss, she appears to have fallen or collapsed, and additional wounds were inflicted while she was on the ground. The total time from the first wound to death would have been approximately 4 to 6 minutes, during which the victim would have been conscious and aware for most of that period. This testimony was crucial for the prosecution's argument that this was not a brief moment of rage but a sustained, deliberate attack during which Sarah could have stopped at multiple points but chose to continue. The forensic evidence presented by the prosecution included blood spatter analysis, DNA evidence, and the results of testing performed on Sarah's clothing and the murder weapon. Criminalist Dr. Teresa Vaughn explained how the blood spatter patterns throughout the kitchen told the story of Jennifer's movements as she tried to escape, creating a trail of arterial spray and cast-off patterns that documented the attack's progression through the room. The patterns indicate a minimum of 15-20 separate striking motions, Dr. Vaughn testified. This is not consistent with a brief loss of control. This is consistent with a sustained, intentional attack. Perhaps the most damaging testimony for Sarah came from her friend Maya Patel, who reluctantly recounted the conversation in late January where Sarah had said she sometimes wished something would happen to her mother. Maya appeared distressed throughout her testimony, clearly struggling with feelings of guilt and betrayal as she provided evidence against her friend. Sarah said she felt like she was drowning, like there was no air in her life because her mom controlled everything, Maya testified, tears streaming down her face. She said sometimes she thought the only way she'd ever be free is if something happened to her mom. I thought she just meant like if her mom got sick or something, or maybe if Sarah ran away. I never thought she meant this. The prosecution rested its case after 6 days of testimony, having established that Sarah had killed her mother during a sustained attack, had been functioning rationally before and after the crime, and had even contemplated her mother's death in the weeks before the murder. The defense's case would now need to provide context for these facts, transforming Sarah from a cold-blooded killer into a desperate victim who had finally snapped under unbearable psychological pressure. Defense attorney Robert Callahan began presenting Sarah's case by calling Patricia Greenwood, Jennifer's sister and Sarah's aunt, who provided devastating testimony about her late sister's controlling behavior and the numerous times she had tried to intervene. Patricia described visits to the Mitchell home where she observed Jennifer berating Sarah for minor mistakes, tracking her daughter's location obsessively through phone apps, and planning every minute of Sarah's life without any input from the teenager herself. "I love my sister, but I did not like the way she treated Sarah," Patricia testified, her voice heavy with emotion. "I told Jenny multiple times that she was going too far, that Sarah needed space to grow and make her own choices. Jenny's response was always that I didn't understand, that she was preparing Sarah for success in a competitive world. I offered to let Sarah live with me if things got too intense, but Jenny refused to even consider it. She said Sarah belonged with her mother and that she knew what was best for her daughter." Patricia went on to describe the final months before the murder, when Jennifer's control had intensified after Sarah began expressing interest in colleges and majors that didn't align with Jennifer's plans. "Jenny showed me the spreadsheet she'd created for Sarah's entire college experience," Patricia recalled. "It had courses mapped out semester by semester, internships scheduled for specific summers, even the study abroad programs Sarah should attend. When I asked if Sarah had any input into this plan, Jenny seemed genuinely confused by the question. She said, 'Sarah's 17. She doesn't have the experience or perspective to make these decisions. That's what I'm here for.'" The defense's star witness was Dr. Amanda Foster, the clinical psychologist who had evaluated Sarah extensively and prepared the report on coercive control and its psychological effects. Dr. Foster spent an entire day on the witness stand, patiently explaining to the jury the concept of coercive control, how it differs from normal parental authority, and why it can have such devastating effects on the victim's psychological functioning. Using charts and graphics approved by the judge, Dr. Foster illustrated the cycle of control that Jennifer had established. Surveillance of Sarah's activities and communications, isolation from friends and support systems, monopolization of perception through constant criticism and impossible standards, degradation through conditional love based on achievement, and demonstrations of power through unilateral decision-making about Sarah's life. Coercive control is now recognized in the psychological literature as a form of psychological abuse that can be as damaging, and in some cases more damaging, than physical abuse, Dr. Foster explained. The victim experiences a gradual erosion of their sense of self, their autonomy, their ability to trust their own thoughts and feelings. Over time, this creates a psychological state where the victim feels trapped, hopeless, and desperate for escape. In Sarah's case, after 17 years of this treatment, she had reached what we call a psychological breaking point, where her capacity for rational decision-making was severely compromised by the accumulated trauma and the perception that she had no other way out. Dr. Foster went on to explain that Sarah's flat affect and emotional presentation after the murder were actually consistent with dissociative responses commonly seen in trauma victims. When people experience extreme stress or commit acts that are fundamentally at odds with their self-concept, the mind can essentially compartmentalize or dissociate from those experiences as a protective mechanism, she testified. Sarah's calm demeanor after killing her mother was not evidence of cold calculation. It was evidence of profound psychological trauma and her mind's attempt to protect her from the full reality of what had happened. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Michael Patterson challenged Dr. Foster's conclusions, asking pointed questions about whether Sarah had truly had no alternatives to murder. "Dr. Foster, Sarah could have called her aunt and moved in with her, correct?" Patterson asked. Dr. Foster acknowledged this was theoretically possible, but explained that victims of coercive control often cannot recognize available options because their perception has been so distorted by the controlling relationship. When you've been told your entire life that your mother knows best and makes all decisions, it becomes neurologically difficult to recognize and act on alternatives, she explained. Patterson pressed further. But Dr. Foster, Sarah was a straight A student, captain of the debate team, accepted to multiple prestigious universities. Are you telling this jury that this intelligent, accomplished young woman couldn't figure out that there were options other than stabbing her mother 27 times? Dr. Foster maintained her position. Intelligence and accomplishment don't protect someone from the psychological effects of sustained coercive control. In fact, high-achieving children of controlling parents often struggle more because they've internalized the belief that they must be perfect, must meet expectations, must not disappoint. Sarah's achievements were actually evidence of the control's effectiveness, not evidence that she was immune to its psychological damage. The defense also called Dr. James Morrison, a neuropsychologist who testified about adolescent brain development and impulse control. Dr. Morrison explained that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making and impulse control, continues developing into the mid-20s, meaning that Sarah's brain was still maturing at the time of the crime. Adolescents are neurologically more vulnerable to emotional overwhelm and less capable of the kind of rational risk assessment we expect from adults, Dr. Morrison testified. When you combine a still developing brain with the kind of chronic stress and trauma Dr. Foster described, you create a perfect storm where impulsive, desperate actions become more likely. The most anticipated testimony came when Sarah Mitchell herself took the stand, a decision her defense team had debated extensively before ultimately concluding that the jury needed to hear directly from Sarah about her experience of living under her mother's control. Dressed in a simple gray sweater and black pants, her dark hair pulled back in the same ponytail she'd worn the night of her arrest, Sarah looked younger than her 17 years as she took the oath and settled into the witness chair. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with anticipation, fell into absolute silence as Robert Callahan approached his client to begin direct examination. Callahan started gently, walking Sarah through her childhood memories before her mother's controlling behavior had fully crystallized into the system that would eventually dominate every aspect of her life. Sarah spoke quietly about her father, whose death when she was 3 had left only fragments of memory, warm impressions of being held and feeling safe, but nothing concrete enough to sustain her through the years that followed. She described her elementary school years as relatively normal, her mother involved but not yet suffocating, attending school events and helping with homework but still allowing Sarah space to play, to make friends, to be a child. When did you first notice that your mother's involvement in your life was becoming different? Callahan asked. Sarah paused, her eyes distant as she accessed memories that seemed to cause physical pain. I think it was 4th or 5th grade, she said slowly. I brought home a report card with all A's and 1 B+ in math. I remember being excited about the A's, but Mom didn't even mention them. She spent the whole evening talking about the B+, asking me why I hadn't worked harder, telling me that B's were for average students and I wasn't average. She made me cancel my sleepover that weekend to do extra math practice. That was when I started to understand that her love came with conditions. Over the next hour, Sarah methodically described the escalation of control as she moved through middle school and into high school. The installation of monitoring software on her phone when she was 12, presented as being for her safety, but used to read every text message and track every location. The requirement that she submit a daily schedule accounting for every 15 minutes of her time, with deviations requiring prior approval or detailed explanation. The gradual isolation from friends whose families Jennifer deemed not ambitious enough, or whose influence she considered detrimental to Sarah's. Focus on achievement. By freshman year, I wasn't allowed to go to parties or casual hangouts, Sarah testified. Mom said they were distractions, that I needed to focus on building a resume for college. Every activity had to serve that purpose. I couldn't do something just because I enjoyed it. When Callahan asked Sarah about her relationship with her mother, asking whether she had loved Jennifer despite the control, Sarah's composure cracked for the first time. Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to articulate the complexity of loving someone who was simultaneously her only parent and her primary source of trauma. "I loved her," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "She was my mom. She was all I had. But I felt like I couldn't breathe around her. Every conversation was about my performance, my grades, my future. She never asked how I felt, what I wanted, what made me happy. I don't think she knew me at all, not really. She knew the version of me she'd created, but not who I actually was." Callahan then guided Sarah through the events of January 2023, when she had received acceptance letters from multiple universities and had allowed herself to hope that college might represent a kind of freedom, a chance to finally make decisions about her own life. Sarah described the excitement of opening the envelope from Brown University, her first choice, and finding not just an acceptance, but an invitation to join their creative writing program with a partial scholarship. "I wanted to write," Sarah explained to the jury. "Not business memos or marketing copy, but stories, novels, maybe poetry. I'd been writing secretly for years, hiding notebooks in my closet because I knew Mom wouldn't approve. Brown felt like my chance to finally pursue something that mattered to me, not just something that would make me successful by her definition." The testimony grew more emotional as Sarah described showing her mother the Brown acceptance letter, expecting that Jennifer would be proud despite their differences about Sarah's intended major. Instead, Jennifer had barely glanced at the letter before dismissing it as not a serious option, explaining that she'd already decided Sarah would attend Wharton to study business. "I tried to argue with her," Sarah recalled. "I said it was my life, my choice, my future. She laughed at that. She actually laughed and said, 'You're 17 years old. You don't know anything about life or choices or futures. That's why you have a mother.' Then she told me she'd already paid the deposit at Wharton." Sarah's voice grew steadier as she described the growing realization over the next few weeks that her mother had taken control even of this decision, perhaps the most important of Sarah's young life. The discovery that Jennifer had been accessing Sarah's email account and had declined Brown's offer in her name. The finding of a detailed 5-year plan Jennifer had created, mapping out not just Sarah's college years but her 20s, including career trajectory, appropriate salary ranges, even optimal age for marriage. Looking at that document, seeing my entire future planned out without me, it felt like I was disappearing, Sarah testified, like I wasn't even a real person, just this project she was working on. And I realized it would never end. Even after college, even after I had a job, she would still be controlling everything. I would never be free to make my own choices. Callahan approached the most difficult part of the testimony carefully, his voice gentle as he asked Sarah to describe the night of February 10th. Sarah took a long drink of water before beginning, her hands trembling slightly as she set the cup down. She described the dinner conversation about Wharton and the business school curriculum Jennifer had selected, the building tension as Sarah tried once again to express her desire to make her own decision, and her mother's ultimate threat. If Sarah wouldn't follow Jennifer's plan, she would receive no financial support. Jennifer would refuse to complete financial aid forms, and Sarah could figure out her life on her own. "I went to my room around 10 o'clock, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I lay in bed, thinking about everything I'd worked for, all the straight A's and the perfect behavior and the achievements. And I realized none of it mattered because it wasn't even mine. It was all for her, to meet her standards, to fulfill her vision. And Brown was gone. the one thing I'd wanted for myself, and she'd taken it away without even telling me. Sarah described lying in the dark for hours, her mind racing, feeling trapped and desperate and hopeless. I kept thinking, what do I do? Where do I go? How do I get out of this? But every option I considered, I knew she would block. She controlled my money, my documents, my ability to leave. Legally, I couldn't do anything without her permission for another year. A whole year of living like this. And then even after I turned 18, she'd still be there, still trying to run my life. The moment when Sarah decided to go downstairs to confront her mother one final time remained somewhat unclear in her memory, a fact she acknowledged to the jury. I remember getting out of bed, remember walking down the stairs, but it's like I was watching myself from outside my body. She testified. I found Mom in the kitchen on her laptop, probably working even at 1:30 in the morning like she always did. I tried to talk to her, tried to explain one more time that I needed to make my own choices, that I couldn't live like this. She didn't even look up from her screen. She just said the discussion was over, that I'd thank her in 10 years. What happened next, Sarah described in a voice that had gone flat again, her earlier emotion draining away as she recounted the actual violence. I saw the knife block on the counter. I remember thinking very clearly, if she's gone, I'll be free. It wasn't emotional. It was just logical, like solving a math problem. If the problem is that she controls everything, then the solution is that she can't control anything anymore. Sarah described taking the largest knife, approaching her mother, and stabbing her in the back. She spun around and I saw her face, saw the shock and pain, and she asked why, asked what I was doing, and I couldn't stop. Every time I thought about stopping, I thought about Brown and the 5-year plan and the spreadsheets and the monitoring and never being free, and I stabbed her again. The jury sat in stunned silence as Sarah described the sustained attack, her mother's attempts to defend herself and pleas for mercy, and the moment when Jennifer finally stopped moving and the kitchen fell silent except for Sarah's own breathing. I stood there looking at her, at what I'd done, and I felt nothing, Sarah testified. I know I should have felt horror or grief or guilt, but there was just this empty space inside me. I went to the sink and started washing the knife, thinking I should clean up. But then I realized there was no point. I couldn't undo it, and part of me didn't even want to. For the first time in my life, she couldn't tell me what to do. Callahan asked the critical question carefully. Sarah, do you feel remorse for killing your mother? Sarah was silent for a long moment, and observers noted that this pause, this apparent struggle to answer, was more authentic than any of the prepared statements she might have offered. I don't know, she finally said, her honesty potentially damaging, but also somehow convincing. I know I should. I know what I did was wrong. I took a life, my mother's life, but I also feel relief. And I hate myself for feeling relief, which maybe is its own kind of remorse. I'm sorry she's dead. I'm sorry I killed her. But I'm not sorry I'm not under her control anymore, and I don't know how to separate those things. The cross-examination by prosecutor Michael Patterson was aggressive and pointed, designed to undermine the sympathy Sarah's direct testimony might have generated. Patterson immediately challenged Sarah's characterization of her mother's behavior as abusive, suggesting instead that Jennifer had been a dedicated single mother with high expectations. Your mother worked hard to provide you with opportunities, didn't she? Patterson asked. She paid for your education, your activities, your college applications. She wanted you to be successful. That's not abuse, Ms. Mitchell. That's parenting. Sarah pushed back, her voice gaining strength. She didn't want me to be successful. She wanted to control me. There's a difference between encouraging your child and erasing them. She didn't see me as a person with my own thoughts and dreams. She saw me as an extension of herself, something to be managed and perfected. Patterson pressed harder, but lots of teenagers feel their parents don't understand them. That doesn't give them the right to commit murder, does it? Sarah acknowledged this point, but insisted her situation had been different, more extreme, rising to the level of psychological abuse that experts had documented. Patterson then systematically went through the alternatives Sarah could have pursued instead of murder. She could have contacted her aunt, who had offered her a place to stay. She could have spoken with school counselors. She could have waited one more year until she was 18 and legally independent. She could have applied for financial aid on her own, attended a state school, worked her way through college. "You had options, didn't you, Ms. Mitchell?" Patterson demanded. "You just didn't like those options because they would have been hard. Murder was easier than patience or compromise." Sarah's response to this was one of the most powerful moments of her testimony. "You're right that I had options," she said, looking directly at Patterson. "But I couldn't see them. When you've been controlled your entire life, when every attempt to assert yourself has been crushed, when the person who's supposed to love you unconditionally makes that love dependent on meeting impossible standards, your ability to recognize options disappears." Dr. Foster explained this. "I'm not asking you to excuse what I did. I'm asking you to understand why I did it. And I'm asking you to consider whether a person who's been psychologically tortured for 17 years should be judged the same as someone who kills for money or jealousy or other reasons." Patterson concluded his cross-examination by playing portions of Sarah's confession video, particularly the sections where she described the attack with clinical detachment and admitted she'd thought about cleaning up the scene to avoid detection. "This is consciousness of guilt, Ms. Mitchell," Patterson said. "You knew what you'd done was wrong. You tried to hide it. That's not someone in a dissociative state. That's someone who committed a calculated murder and briefly tried to cover it up before deciding that confession was the better strategy." The prosecution's rebuttal case focused on undermining the defense's psychological experts and presenting evidence of Sarah's rational functioning in the hours and days before the murder. They called Sarah's teachers, who testified that she had seemed normal in school on February 10th, participating in class discussions and completing assignments without any apparent signs of psychological distress. They presented social media posts Sarah had made in the weeks before the murder, showing her interacting with friends and posting about typical teenage concerns, with no indication of the severe psychological crisis the defense described. Dr. Leonard Ross, the prosecution's psychiatric expert, provided rebuttal testimony challenging Dr. Foster's diagnosis and conclusions. "While I agree that Ms. Mitchell was subject to a controlling parenting style, I do not agree that this rose to the level of psychological abuse that would impair her decision-making capacity," Dr. Ross testified. "Many teenagers, perhaps even a majority, experience conflicts with their parents about college, career choices, and autonomy. The vast majority resolve these conflicts without resorting to violence. Ms. Mitchell's actions were not the inevitable result of her circumstances, but rather a choice she made among many available options." Dr. Ross particularly challenged the defense's characterization of Sarah's flat affect as evidence of dissociation. What the defense calls dissociation, I would characterize as emotional compartmentalization, which is actually evidence of psychological sophistication rather than impairment, he testified. Ms. Mitchell was able to separate her emotional response from her cognitive functions, allowing her to think clearly about how to respond to the situation she had created. This is not dissociation. This is advanced psychological coping that allowed her to function rationally in an extremely stressful situation. The closing arguments in Sarah Mitchell's trial took place over 2 days in late September 2023, as leaves began to turn color outside the courthouse windows and the Portland community waited to learn the fate of the teenager who had killed her mother 7 months earlier. Prosecutor Michael Patterson's closing argument emphasized the sustained, brutal nature of the attack and Sarah's rational functioning before and after the crime. Ladies and gentlemen, no matter how much you may sympathize with Sarah Mitchell's frustration about her mother's expectations, no matter how much you may wish she had made different choices, you cannot escape the fundamental facts of this case, Patterson told the jury. Sarah Mitchell stabbed her mother 27 times while Jennifer begged for her life. She did this not in a moment of sudden rage or temporary insanity, but after hours of lying in bed, thinking about her situation. She selected a weapon. She approached her victim. She carried out a sustained attack that lasted several minutes, during which she could have stopped at any point but chose to continue. Patterson addressed the psychological testimony directly, acknowledging that Jennifer's parenting style had been strict and perhaps even excessive, but arguing this didn't excuse murder. Dr. Foster wants you to believe that Sarah had no choice, that she was driven to this crime by unbearable psychological pressure, Patterson said. But the evidence shows otherwise. Sarah was a high-functioning teenager with resources, intelligence, and options. Her aunt had offered her a home. Her counselors were available. She could have waited 1 year and walked away legally. Instead, she chose the permanent solution of murder over the temporary difficulty of patience. The prosecutor concluded with an emotional appeal about justice for Jennifer Mitchell, who had devoted her life to her daughter and died terrified and in pain at her child's hands. Jennifer Mitchell deserves justice, Patterson said. She may not have been a perfect mother, but she didn't deserve to be stabbed to death in her own kitchen by the daughter she loved. Your verdict should reflect the severity of this crime and the deliberate choices Sarah Mitchell made that night. The state asks you to find her guilty of intentional and knowing murder. Defense attorney Robert Callahan's closing argument took a different approach, focusing extensively on the psychological evidence and asking the jury to consider whether Sarah could be held fully responsible for actions taken while in a state of severe psychological impairment. This is not a case about a spoiled teenager who didn't get her way, Callahan began. This is a case about a young woman who was psychologically destroyed by a parent who loved the idea of a perfect daughter more than she loved the actual human being that daughter was. Callahan systematically reviewed the evidence of Jennifer's control, the monitoring software, the appropriated email accounts, the 5-year plan, the unilateral decisions about Sarah's future made without her knowledge or consent. This wasn't strict parenting, he argued. This was psychological abuse that fits every criteria in the literature for coercive control. Dr. Foster explained how this kind of sustained control systematically erodes a victim's sense of self, their autonomy, their ability to recognize alternatives. Sarah Mitchell didn't see options because 17 years of psychological conditioning had taught her that resistance was futile, and her mother's control was absolute. The defense attorney acknowledged the brutality of the crime, but framed it as evidence of how completely Sarah had been psychologically damaged. 27 stab wounds don't show calculation, Callahan argued. They show desperation. They show a complete psychological breakdown. They show what happens when a human being who has been systematically denied autonomy and identity finally breaks under that pressure. Sarah's flat affect afterward wasn't consciousness of guilt. It was evidence that her mind had essentially shut down to protect her from the full reality of what she'd done. Callahan concluded with a passionate plea for the jury to consider Sarah's age, her psychological state, and the mitigating circumstances that made this crime different from a cold-blooded murder. The state wants you to believe Sarah is a monster who killed her mother over a college dispute, he said. But the evidence shows a traumatized teenager who saw no way out of a psychologically abusive situation and made a terrible, tragic choice. She deserves to be held accountable, but she also deserves understanding and mercy. The charge is intentional and knowing murder, and the state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Sarah acted with the kind of deliberate, premeditated intent that charge requires. The evidence of her psychological state creates reasonable doubt. I ask you to find her not guilty of intentional murder, and instead guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter, which more accurately reflects what happened that terrible night. The jury deliberated for 4 days, an unusually long time that suggested deep divisions among the jurors about how to weigh the psychological evidence against the facts of the brutal attack. During the wait, Sarah remained in custody at the Cumberland County Jail, where officials reported she spent most of her time reading and participating in educational programs, maintaining the same controlled demeanor she'd displayed throughout the trial. Media commentary during the deliberation period reflected the national divide about the case, with some pundits arguing that Sarah represented a dangerous trend of teenagers refusing to accept appropriate parental authority, while others contended she was the victim of a system that failed to recognize and intervene in psychological abuse until it was too late. On October 3, 2023, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, with every seat taken and additional spectators standing in the back and overflowing into the hallway. Sarah sat beside her attorney, her face pale but composed as always, showing no external signs of the anxiety she must have been feeling. Judge Patricia Thornton entered and called the court to order, then addressed the jury foreperson, asking if they had reached a unanimous verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The foreperson, a middle-aged man who taught high school English, responded. The clerk retrieved the verdict form and handed it to Judge Thornton, who reviewed it briefly before passing it back to be read aloud. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as the foreperson stood and unfolded the paper. In the matter of State of Maine versus Sarah Mitchell, on the charge of intentional or knowing murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of the lesser included offense of manslaughter. The courtroom erupted in a mix of reactions, some spectators gasping or crying, others nodding as if this was the outcome they'd expected. Sarah's face crumpled for just a moment before she regained control, wiping at her eyes with shaking hands. Callahan placed a supportive hand on her shoulder and leaned in to whisper something to her. Patricia Greenwood, Sarah's aunt, who had attended every day of the trial, sobbed openly in the gallery. Judge Thornton gavelled for order and asked the foreperson to confirm that this was the unanimous verdict of the jury, which all 12 members affirmed. The manslaughter verdict represented a compromise, with jurors later speaking to media about how they had struggled to balance Sarah's clear responsibility for her mother's death against the extensive evidence of psychological abuse and impaired mental state. We couldn't ignore that she killed her mother, and we couldn't ignore the brutality of the attack, one juror explained in a post-trial interview. But we also couldn't ignore the years of psychological control and the expert testimony about how that affected Sarah's decision-making capacity. Manslaughter seemed like the right balance between accountability and mercy. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later, in mid-November 2023, with Judge Thornton facing the difficult task of determining an appropriate sentence for a teenager convicted of killing her mother under extraordinary psychological circumstances. Maine law provided for a maximum sentence of 30 years for manslaughter, but also allowed for significant judicial discretion based on the defendant's age, mental state, and the circumstances of the crime. Both sides presented extensive arguments about what justice required in this unique case. Prosecutor Patterson argued for a lengthy sentence, emphasizing that while the jury had found mitigating circumstances sufficient to reduce the charge from murder to manslaughter, Sarah had still taken a life in a brutal, sustained attack. The victim's family deserves justice, and society needs to know that even under difficult circumstances, murder will be met with serious consequences, Patterson argued. 8. He recommended a sentence of 25 years, acknowledging Sarah's age and psychological state, but insisting that the severity of the crime warranted significant incarceration. Defense attorney Callahan presented a markedly different recommendation, arguing for a sentence of 10 to 15 years with eligibility for parole after serving 7 years. Your Honor, Sarah Mitchell has already been severely punished, Callahan argued. She lost her mother, whether by her own hand or not. She has been incarcerated for 9 months awaiting trial. She has had to live with the knowledge of what she did, and will carry that burden for the rest of her life. Most importantly, she committed this crime as a 17-year-old suffering from severe psychological trauma. Justice in this case means recognizing her diminished culpability and giving her a chance at rehabilitation and eventual reintegration into society. The most powerful testimony at the sentencing hearing came from Patricia Greenwood, Jennifer's sister, who provided a victim impact statement that acknowledged both her grief for her sister and her understanding of the circumstances that led to the tragedy. I love Jenny, Patricia said, her voice steady despite obvious emotion. She was my sister, my friend, and I miss her every day, but I also saw what she did to Sarah, how she controlled and suffocated her niece until Sarah felt she had no way out. I don't excuse what Sarah did. Taking a life is wrong, always. But I understand why it happened, and I believe Sarah deserves a chance to heal from the trauma Jenny inflicted, and to eventually build a life that her mother never allowed her to have. This statement was particularly significant, given that Patricia was Jennifer's closest living relative and thus had standing as the victim's family representative. Her willingness to advocate for mercy for Sarah rather than maximum punishment carried substantial weight with Judge Thornton, who had specifically asked whether any family members wished to provide impact statements. Patricia went on to say that she hoped to maintain a relationship with Sarah, that she didn't want to lose her niece in addition to her sister, and that she believed with proper treatment and support, Sarah could eventually become a productive member of society. Sarah herself addressed the court, delivering a statement that showed more genuine emotion and the insight than she had displayed during much of the trial. I know that nothing I say can bring my mother back or undo the pain I've caused, Sarah began, her voice trembling. I took a life, my mother's life, and I have to live with that forever. I've spent every day since that night trying to understand how I got to that point, how the love I had for my mother became so twisted up with anger and desperation that I could do what I did. Sarah continued, showing signs of the psychological work she'd been doing in custody. I understand now that I did have options, even if I couldn't see them at the time. I understand that my mother's control, as damaging as it was, didn't give me the right to take her life. But I also understand that I was broken, psychologically broken, and I acted from that brokenness. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't think what I did can be forgiven. I'm asking for a chance to heal, to get the psychological help I need, and to eventually do something meaningful with my life. My mother wanted me to be successful, and maybe the best way I can honor her memory is to become the person she wanted me to be, just in my own way and on my own terms. Judge Thornton took several days to consider the arguments and review the extensive pre-sentencing report prepared by the probation department before announcing her decision, when the parties reconvened in court on November 20th. The judge delivered a lengthy statement explaining her reasoning before pronouncing sentence. This court has carefully considered the nature of the crime, the defendant's age and psychological state, the extensive evidence of mitigating circumstances, and the needs of justice and public safety. Judge Thornton began. The jury's verdict of manslaughter rather than murder reflects their finding that while Sarah Mitchell intentionally caused her mother's death. She did so under circumstances that reduced her culpability. This court agrees with that assessment. The evidence of years of psychological abuse, coercive control, and the systematic erosion of Sarah's autonomy and identity provides crucial context for understanding how this tragedy occurred. At the same time, the court cannot ignore that Sarah took her mother's life in a brutal attack that caused immense suffering. Jennifer Mitchell deserved to live, deserved to see her daughter grow into adulthood, deserved the chance to eventually understand the damage her controlling behavior had caused, and to change. Sarah's actions denied her mother that chance. Judge Thornton explained that she had struggled with determining the appropriate balance between accountability and mercy, between recognizing Sarah's diminished culpability and acknowledging the severity of taking a human life. Sarah Mitchell was not a monster. She was a traumatized teenager who broke under extraordinary psychological pressure and made a terrible, irreversible choice. But she is also responsible for that choice and must face consequences that reflect both the seriousness of her crime and the circumstances that contributed to it. The judge then pronounced sentence. Sarah Mitchell, having been found guilty of manslaughter, this court sentences you to 18 years in the Maine Department of Corrections, with eligibility for parole consideration after serving 12 years. During your incarceration, you will participate in intensive psychological treatment to address the trauma you experienced and the violence you committed. You will complete your high school education and pursue post-secondary education as available through prison programs. This court believes that with appropriate treatment and support, you can eventually be rehabilitated and released to live a productive life. But you must first serve a sentence that acknowledges the gravity of taking your mother's life. The 18-year sentence with 12-year minimum was seen as a middle ground between the prosecution's request for 25 years and the defense's request for 10 to 15 years. Legal observers noted that Judge Thornton had carefully balanced the competing considerations, imposing a serious sentence that reflected the severity of the crime, while also acknowledging Sarah's age, psychological state, and potential for rehabilitation. The sentence meant that Sarah, who was 17 at the time of sentencing, would be eligible for parole at age 29, still young enough to build a life after release, but having served significant time for her crime. As Sarah was led from the courtroom to begin serving her sentence, she turned to look at her Aunt Patricia one final time. Unlike Emma Anderson, whose family had abandoned her, Sarah had at least one family member who had maintained support and who mouthed, "I love you," as the deputies took Sarah away. This small moment of connection suggested that Sarah's path forward, while difficult, might not be entirely without hope or human relationships to sustain her through the years ahead. 5 years after the murder, Sarah Mitchell remains incarcerated at the Maine Correctional Center for Women, where prison officials report she has been a model inmate, earning her high school equivalency degree, completing an associate's degree through a prison education program, and participating extensively in psychological treatment. Her therapist notes significant progress in understanding the dynamics of her relationship with her mother and developing healthier ways of thinking about control, autonomy, and conflict resolution. Sarah has also become a mentor to other young women in the facility, using her own experience to help them process trauma and make better choices than she did. Patricia Greenwood visits Sarah monthly, maintaining the family connection that Sarah feared she had forever destroyed the night she killed her mother. Patricia has established a college fund for Sarah to use upon her release, hoping that her niece will eventually be able to pursue the education in creative writing that Jennifer had denied her. Sarah made a terrible mistake that cost my sister her life, Patricia explains when asked about her continued support for her niece. But I don't believe one terrible act should define someone's entire life. especially when that person was a traumatized teenager who had been psychologically abused for years. Sarah deserves a chance at redemption. The case of Sarah Mitchell has had lasting impacts on the legal and psychological communities, becoming a standard reference in discussions about coercive control, juvenile justice, and the appropriate response to family violence committed by young offenders. Maine subsequently updated its laws to specifically recognize coercive control as a form of domestic abuse, allowing for earlier intervention by social services when this pattern is identified. Schools throughout the state have implemented better training for counselors and teachers to recognize signs of psychological abuse in students, with the goal of identifying and intervening in controlling family dynamics before they escalate to tragedy. Dr. Amanda Foster, the psychologist who testified at Sarah's trial, has become a leading voice in advocating for recognition of coercive control in legal contexts. She has published extensively on the Mitchell case as an example of how failure to recognize and address psychological abuse can lead to tragic outcomes. Sarah Mitchell's case demonstrates that we cannot wait until physical violence occurs to take family abuse seriously. Dr. Foster writes, Jennifer Mitchell never hit her daughter, never left visible bruises, but the psychological damage she inflicted was profound and ultimately led to her own death and the destruction of her daughter's life. We must develop better systems for identifying and intervening in coercively controlling relationships before they reach such tragic conclusions. The broader conversation sparked by Sarah's case has contributed to an evolving national discussion about what constitutes child abuse and when parental authority crosses the line into psychological damage. While some critics argue that the sympathy generated for Sarah sets a dangerous precedent that might excuse violence by teenagers who simply don't like their parents' rules, many mental health professionals and legal scholars contend that the case highlights a real gap in how society recognizes and responds to non-physical abuse. Not all controlling parents produce children who become violent, one juvenile justice expert notes. But the research is clear that sustained coercive control can cause severe psychological damage. Sarah Mitchell's case reminds us that we need better ways to identify and address this form of abuse before it destroys families. Sarah's parole eligibility date will arrive in 2035, when she will be 29 years old. At that time, the parole board will consider her institutional behavior, her progress in treatment, her understanding of and remorse for her crime, and the risk she might pose to public safety if released. Prison officials who work with Sarah report that she expresses genuine remorse for her mother's death and has developed insight into alternative ways she could have handled the situation, though she maintains that her psychological state at the time made those alternatives invisible to her. I can see now that I could have moved in with my aunt, could have waited a year and gone to college on my own terms, could have found ways to establish boundaries without violence, Sarah has said in recent therapy sessions. But I couldn't see any of that then. I felt like I was drowning, and killing my mother felt like the only way to get air. I understand now that was a distortion caused by the years of control, but understanding it intellectually doesn't change what I did. If granted parole in 2035, Sarah will have served 17 years for killing her mother from age 17 to 34, a significant portion of her young adult life. Mental health professionals involved in her treatment believe she can successfully reintegrate into society with proper support and supervision, noting that she has used her time in prison to address her psychological trauma and develop the emotional regulation skills she lacked at 17. Sarah has done remarkable work on herself, her primary therapist reports. She's not the same person who walked into this facility 5 years ago. She has insight, empathy, and genuine remorse. She understands that her mother's control didn't excuse her violence, but she also understands that she needs to advocate for her own needs in healthy ways rather than allowing resentment to build until it explodes. The legacy of State of Maine versus Sarah Mitchell extends beyond the specific tragedy of one family in Portland. It has become part of an ongoing national conversation about the boundaries of parental authority, the psychological impact of controlling parenting styles, and how the justice system should respond when traumatized teenagers commit violent crimes. The case raises difficult questions without easy answers. At what point does strict parenting become psychological abuse? How do we balance holding young offenders accountable while recognizing their developmental limitations and traumatic circumstances? What does justice look like in cases where both the perpetrator and the victim deserve some measure of sympathy?